75 years old, surrounded by hundreds in a noisy, sun-scorched market, an old man stood trembling as voices rose around him, calling him a thief. His crime? A single roasted corn. His truth? He was once a beloved teacher, the same man who taught discipline, hope, and letters to the boy who would one day become President Ibrahim Traoré. But no one saw that. No one cared. As the crowd closed in, phones recording, insults flying, something unexpected happened. A black car slowed to a stop. Doors opened. Silence fell. What happened next is not just a story, it's a mirror. In a world so quick to judge, how many lives do we damage because we don't ask one simple question? What's the truth? This story is inspired by real emotions and universal truths. While the characters and events are fictionalized for storytelling impact, the pain of injustice and the power of compassion are deeply real. Let this be more than a story. Let it be a reminder. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage are not on the battlefield, but in the middle of a marketplace where one man decides to stand up for what is right. The sun in Ouagadougou that afternoon wasn't just hot, it was unforgiving. The sky above the bustling capital of Burkina Faso shimmered with waves of heat, casting a yellow haze over rusted rooftops, cracked pavements, and the chaos of 1,000 stories unfolding at once. The marketplace was alive with sound and motion, a tangled web of shouting vendors, honking motorbikes, clanging metal pots, and radios blasting music that mixed with the cries of street children weaving between the legs of passers-by. The scent of roasted corn hung thick in the air, sweet, smoky, slightly charred, rising from dozens of street grills manned by women fanning flames with old cardboard, sweat glistening on their foreheads. Smoke curled upward, blurring the line between the sun and the city, and somewhere in that haze walked a man who didn't quite belong. He moved slowly, almost out of rhythm with the world around him, as if time ticked differently in his bones. His name was Mr. Doumbia, 75 years old, thin as a reed, skin folded into deep lines like dry riverbeds after drought. His faded brown shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat. His trousers, carefully ironed despite their age, were too big now for his shrinking frame, held up by a rope in place of a belt. One shoe sole flapped a little as he walked, slapping the dirt like an offbeat drum. No one noticed him. No one moved aside. He slipped between people like a ghost in the daylight. But years ago, many, many years ago, people used to stop when they saw Mr. Doumbia. Children would stand straighter. Parents would nod with respect. Because back then, he was more than just an old man with nothing in his pockets. He was a teacher, one of the best. He taught in dusty classrooms where chalk dust danced in the sunlight, where boys with torn uniforms learned the difference between power and wisdom. His voice once commanded rooms full of energy and rebellion, and gently shaped futures out of chaos. Among his students were judges, doctors, soldiers, and even one boy, quiet but sharp-eyed, who always sat in the front row and never missed a word. Ibrahim Traoré. But none of that mattered now. Mr. Doumbia's house, a shack at the edge of the city, was falling apart. Its tin roof had holes that leaked even when it wasn't raining. There was no pension, no children. His wife had passed 10 years earlier. Since then, his only company was an old radio, a wooden chair, and the creaking of his own memories. That afternoon, hunger pulled him from his home. Not the hunger of desperation, but of quiet nostalgia. Corn roasted fresh over open flames had always been his favorite snack. It reminded him of evenings long past, of laughter in schoolyards, of simpler times. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out 4 coins, all he had left that day, wrapped tightly in a handkerchief. Enough, he hoped, for just 1 corn. But the moment he stepped into the marketplace, it was as if the city rejected his presence. The heat pushed down harder. A young man nearly knocked him over with a bicycle. A group of teenagers laughed behind his back. One of them mimicked his limping walk. Still, he walked on, eyes scanning for a familiar face, or perhaps just a kind one. And then he saw her. A woman in her 30s stood behind a table of roasted corn. Her name was Miriam, though Mr. Doumbia didn't know that yet. Flames danced below the grill, corn blackened and popped, sending up little bursts of ash. Her brows were furrowed, her lips tight, eyes darting left and right. She was arguing with someone loudly about change for a 500-franc note. Her voice cut through the air like a slap. Mr. Dumia hesitated. Should he ask her? But hunger outweighed fear. Slowly he stepped forward, heart quietly hopeful. "Good afternoon, my daughter," he said, voice warm but barely above a whisper. She didn't smile. She didn't even look at him. Not yet. Every morning Mr. Dumbia woke before the sun, not because he had anywhere to be, he hadn't for years, but because his body had grown used to the rhythm of early discipline. Decades of ringing school bells and sleepy students had set his internal clock to rise with the first bird calls. He would sit up slowly from his thin mattress, joints creaking like old wood, and whisper a quiet prayer, thanking God for another day, though he never asked for anything more. His room was small, barely furnished. A wooden table with one leg shorter than the others, a chair whose back had long since broken off. On the wall, a faded photograph of his younger self stood with a row of children in dusty uniforms, all grinning. He often stared at it for long minutes, trying to remember their names. Some came easily. Isabel, Musa, little Idris, who stammered when nervous. And of course, Ibrahim, the quiet one. The one who always finished his work before everyone else, then helped the others. That part of his life felt like another existence. He no longer kept track of dates. Sundays and Tuesdays blended together. His mornings followed a strict, unspoken routine. Fold the thin blanket, sweep the dirt floor, wash his face with water from an old tin jug. Then he would open the small wooden chest beneath his table. Inside were two things: a few crumpled papers from his teaching days, and a book. Its pages yellow, corners torn, but still legible. It was the writings of Senghor, a gift from a student long ago. He read it every morning, carefully turning each page as if it might tear under his fingertips. Reading gave him a sense of purpose, even if no one came to hear his thoughts anymore. He would mouth the words silently, eyes filled with a distant fire, as if for those few minutes he was again standing before a classroom, young, needed, proud. But when the book closed, silence returned. He'd then prepare tea using leftover charcoal from the previous day. No sugar, no milk, just hot water and leaves. It wasn't about taste, it was ritual. He would sip slowly, stare out at the dusty road beyond his window, and listen to the faint city noise creeping in. He didn't own a phone. His radio was broken. The only things that still worked in his life were his memories and his feet, though even they now moved slower than they used to. When hunger came, he tried to ignore it. Some days it left on its own. Other days he let it sit with him, like an old friend he didn't like but couldn't turn away. He had mastered the art of doing with little. Every coin he had was counted, sorted, wrapped in a clean handkerchief, and stored in the corner of his desk as if it were treasure. Not because it was much, but because it was his. That morning, after reading Senghor and finishing his tea, he opened the drawer and stared at the coins for a long time. 4 small coins. Just enough, he hoped, for one roasted corn. He didn't need the food, not really. What he craved was the warmth of it, the memory it brought. As a young man, he used to buy corn on the way home from school, eating it with his wife under the neem tree in their yard. She would laugh at how he always burned his tongue on the first bite. That memory, like many others, lived on the edge of fading. He picked up the handkerchief, tied it slowly, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Then he put on his worn sandals, grabbed his walking stick, and stepped outside. The air was dry and hot already, the sky cloudless. He walked carefully, greeting neighbors who barely looked up, navigating the uneven path like a man crossing a tightrope. His journey to the market was less than 2 kilometers, but it felt longer these days. His back hurt with every step, his knees groaned in protest, but his mind remained focused on that one small reward. The sound of the corn popping on the fire, the smell of charcoal and salt, the heat in his hands. He didn't know that this walk, this quiet, humble decision to buy simple corn, would be the start of a moment that would bring an entire nation to silence. He didn't know that fate, long silent, had finally decided to speak again. The marketplace seemed even louder now, as if the heat itself had raised the volume on every complaint and negotiation. Mr. Dumbia wiped sweat from his brow, steadied his breathing, and followed the smoky scent that guided him like an old friend toward one particular stall. Steel grates hissed over glowing coals, and rows of roasted corn, gold striped with black, rested in neat piles. Behind them stood a woman in her 30s, arms folded, eyes narrowed, lips pursed as though every customer was already a problem she didn't have time for. Her name, though the old man wouldn't learn it until later, was Miriam. He waited politely until she finished snapping at a teenager for paying with a torn bill. The boy hurried away, head down, clutching change that clinked softly in his pocket. Only then did Mr. Dumia step forward, clearing his throat. "Good afternoon, my daughter," he said, voice still warm from years of greeting classrooms. "May I have one corn, please?" Miriam's gaze swept over him like a cold wind. She took in the frayed collar, the rope belt, the trembling hand resting on a simple wooden cane. Her own expression tightened, not with pity, but with irritation, as if poverty itself were an inconvenience she'd been forced to witness. "How much money do you have, old man?" she asked, each word clipped, sharp. He reached into his pocket with deliberate care, unfolded the handkerchief, and laid 4 small coins in his palm. They rattled faintly, fragile music in the cacophony of the market. He offered them up with a hopeful smile. "This should cover 1 corn," he said. "It always has." Miriam's eyebrows arched, or her voice rose enough for several nearby shoppers to hear. "That does not cover my price. Prices change. You people never listen," she snapped, grabbing a corn from the pile and waving it accusingly in front of his face. "You think you can cheat me? Thief!" The word cracked through the air like a whip. Heads turned. A ripple spread, curiosity morphing into eagerness for spectacle. Before Mr. Dumia could protest, Miriam's voice leapt to a shout. "Everybody look! This old man tried to steal from me!" She brandished the corn like evidence in a trial, her other hand pointing at him with theatrical disgust. Within seconds, a circle formed. Men, women, children, motorbike riders dismounting to see what the commotion was about. Smartphones flew up, lenses aimed, red record lights blinking. Commentaries began immediately. "Shameful! He's old enough to know better. Look at him pretending to be innocent." Mr. Dumbia's mouth opened, but his voice was swallowed by the collective roar. Someone tugged at his sleeve, another shoved him from behind, and he stumbled, barely catching himself on his cane. Tears blurred his vision, mixing with sweat. "Please," he whispered, unsure whether anyone could even hear. "I offered the money I have. I meant no harm." Miriam snorted loud enough to draw fresh attention. "Lies! He grabbed the corn and tried to walk away. I caught him." She shook the roasted ear for emphasis, kernels flaking off like sparks. The crowd responded with a chorus of contempt, clucking tongues, shaking heads, fingers wagging judgment. A little boy mimicked the old man's stooped posture, drawing nervous laughter. Cameras zoomed in on the fragile figure at the center. He stood there, surrounded, the sun baking his thin shoulders, the dust clinging to his sandals, confusion and shame carving deeper lines into his face. Every instinct told him to explain, yet each attempt was drowned by the sea of indignation rising around him. A woman near the front crossed her arms and spat at the ground. "Stealing at your age? Disgraceful." A vendor from 2 stalls over chimed in. "These beggars think pity is a free pass." Someone else yelled, "Call the police." And the suggestion was met with eager agreement. In that tightening ring of hostility, Mr. Dumia felt something inside him fracture. Not a bone, but a memory of dignity he had spent a lifetime instilling in others. He clutched the coins still resting in his open palm, as if their dull gleam could testify on his behalf. Yet not a single face softened, not a single ear bent to listen. And all the while the record lights kept blinking, capturing a moment that none of these bystanders would later admit had started with doubt in their hearts. The old teacher, once a guardian of truth, now stood defenseless amid lies, caught in a storm he never saw coming, waiting for mercy that refused to arrive. Little did anyone know a black car was already turning the corner at the far end of the market, its tinted windows reflecting the relentless sun, on a collision course with the injustice unfolding at the center of the crowd. At first it was just noise, raised voices, overlapping questions, Scattered opinions shouted into the air like confetti. But within moments, the marketplace transformed. The crowd, once just a curious gathering of bystanders, began to shift, to swell, to mutate into something uglier. Like a pack of wolves sensing weakness, they closed in, not for justice, not for truth, but for the thrill of judgment. The scent of roasting corn still hung in the heat, but it no longer smelled sweet. It reeked of smoke and tension, of fear and fury without purpose. The dust kicked up beneath feet, now stomping closer, creating a haze through which phones were raised, faces twisted, and voices sharpened. "He looks like a thief," someone said, loud and certain, as if appearances were evidence. "Did you see how he was lurking around her table?" Another voice added. Nobody had, but it didn't matter. One woman, recording on her smartphone with the fervor of a war correspondent, zoomed in on Mr. Dumbia's face. "Look at his eyes, guilty," she muttered, feeding her own narrative. Children weaved through the crowd, mimicking the old man's hunched walk, giggling with the kind of cruelty that comes not from evil, but from ignorance and example. One boy stuck corn husks into his shirt and limped in a circle, while others clapped and laughed. A girl, no older than 10, threw a pebble at Mr. Dumbia's foot. He flinched but said nothing. No one did. No one defended him. No one asked questions. Miriam, emboldened by the mob's growing heat, pointed dramatically again. "I caught him red-handed. He thought I wouldn't see. These old beggars think everything should be free." She turned to a nearby man. "If I hadn't shouted, he'd have walked away with it." The man, large and red-faced, folded his arms. "Shameful," he grunted. "Old and still stealing? No dignity." Another chimed in. "This is what our country has become. Lazy people wanting everything for nothing." Mr. Dumbia's mouth opened again. He held the 4 coins in his hand like a peace offering, like proof, like truth. His voice barely rose above the noise. "I gave her what I had," he said. "I didn't take anything. I just asked." But the crowd wasn't listening. It wasn't that they couldn't hear him. It was that they didn't want to. They had chosen their role. They weren't individuals anymore. They were a mob. A vendor from a nearby stall stepped forward. "You teachers think you're better than everyone else," she hissed. "I bet he's stolen before. People like him hide behind age." Another woman, holding a baby on her hip, pointed at him with disdain. "He should be in jail, not out here pretending to be poor and innocent." The words came faster now, tumbling like rocks down a hill. "Liar. Thief. Con man. Fake." They bounced off Mr. Dumbia's ears, each one cutting deeper than the last. His hand trembled, the coins slipping slightly between his fingers. His vision blurred again. Whether from sun, sweat, or tears, he couldn't tell. He tried to steady himself with his cane, but the tremor in his knees betrayed him. He stumbled sideways, catching himself against a table leg. Nobody moved to help him. A woman near him even stepped back, as if the air around him had become contagious. Cameras kept rolling. The cruelty was casual now, ordinary, instinctive. Someone clicked their tongue. "He'll cry now, watch," they sneered. Another voice mocked his soft-spoken tone, twisting his words into a pathetic caricature. The performance was no longer about truth. It was about entertainment, something to share, something to caption. A man holding a phone leaned closer. "Say it again, old man. Tell us why you tried to steal." His grin was wide. His eyes glinted with amusement. The screen blinked red. Recording. And in the middle of it all stood Mr. Dumbia, shoulders curled inward, eyes full of disbelief. He wasn't angry. He was hurt in a way that didn't show in bruises. It was the kind of hurt that came when your dignity was peeled away, not by force, but by indifference. He had faced hardship before. He had known hunger. He had lost his wife, his health, his home. But nothing had prepared him for this. To be publicly stripped of his humanity, surrounded not by enemies, but by fellow citizens who had forgotten how to see. Just then, far behind the crowd, the low hum of an engine grew louder. A black car, polished to a mirror shine, turned onto the market road. Its presence was quiet, but soon it would speak louder than all the voices screaming injustice. His body stood in the middle of a crowd, bent, broken, surrounded by voices sharper than knives, but his mind began to drift. Somewhere between the jeers and the cameras, Mr. Dumia retreated inward, to a place safer than this. It wasn't the first time he had closed his eyes to escape pain, but today, as dust stung his eyes and accusations rained down like stones, the memories came faster, clearer, a flickering reel of chalkboards and sunlight, of laughter and discipline, of days when his name was spoken with respect, not mockery. He saw the old classroom, the one with wooden desks etched with initials, the green-black chalkboards so worn it barely held chalk anymore. The fan overhead always creaked, and the tin roof leaked during the rainy season, but none of that mattered back then. What mattered were the children, eager, curious, sometimes rebellious. He remembered how they used to groan at tests, how he'd smile quietly, pretending not to enjoy their frustration, how he would stay late after class to help the slowest learners catch up. He was strict, yes, but fair, and they respected that. Among them, one boy had always stood out, small for his age, with sandals held together by wire and a uniform 2 sizes too big. But his eyes, sharp, focused, burning with quiet hunger, never missed a thing. His name was Ibrahim. Ibrahim rarely spoke unless called upon, but when he did, his voice was firm, his thoughts clear. He never asked for help, but he listened carefully when help was offered. He stayed behind once to return a ruler left by a classmate and ended up asking Mr. Dumbia questions about history, justice, power. Deep questions, not usual for a boy of his age. "Ibrahim," Mr. Dumbia whispered under his breath now, barely audible over the marketplace's chaos. The name alone warmed something in him, like a faint candle struggling against the wind. Back in the day, he had told his colleagues, "That boy will go far," not because he was the smartest, though he was among them, but because he had something most children didn't: fire without noise, conviction without arrogance. He was the kind of boy who watched more than he spoke, who paid attention not just to lessons but to people. You could see it in his posture, in how he took correction without resentment, how he helped others without being asked. Years passed. Students came and went. Some grew into respected men and women. Others drifted into obscurity. And Mr. Dumbia, though forgotten by many, had never forgotten the spark he saw in Ibrahim. He often wondered what had become of him, whether the world had hardened or uplifted him. But now, as he stood accused and humiliated, Ibrahim felt 1,000 years away. The world around him was not the one he had spent his life trying to improve. This was a world that shouted before it asked, condemned before it listened. A world where age brought no wisdom in the eyes of strangers, only suspicion. A world where being old and poor meant being disposable. "Thief!" someone yelled again, the words slashing through the crowd like a whip. Another voice laughed. A phone screen lit up inches from his face, capturing every flicker of despair. And still the memory fought to stay alive. He remembered the last day of school before Ibrahim left for the capital. The boy had waited after class, carrying a worn notebook and an awkward smile. "Thank you, sir," he'd said simply. "I'll come back one day." At the time, Mr. Dumbia had smiled, assuming it was a polite goodbye, one of many he'd heard before. But now, standing on shaking legs, face wet with sweat and shame, he wondered, had Ibrahim kept his promise? It was a ridiculous thought, a distraction, but it came to him with such clarity, such ache, that it eclipsed the pain in his knees. Another shove jolted him back to the present. His cane nearly slipped. His coins clinked on the dirt, but he didn't bend to pick them up. The act of bending felt too much like surrender. His heart pounded not with fear but with heartbreak. He had given everything to his students, his mind, his patience, his health, and in return all he had asked from life was peace, a place to grow old with dignity, a world that remembered. Instead he stood here, surrounded, slandered, ridiculed. Was this what it meant to outlive your usefulness? To survive only to be publicly erased? And yet, amid the storm of cruelty, amid the sting of dust and humiliation, he felt something shift, a shadow at the edge of the crowd, a sudden quiet ripple through the noise, tires slowing, the hum of an engine cutting through the air like a thread of fate. Mr. Dumbia blinked through the sunlight, and somewhere beyond the blur, a car door opened. At the far end of the marketplace, Where the noise blurred into heat and the air shimmered above the road, a sleek black car turned the corner. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, its surface reflecting the sunlight like polished obsidian. The tinted windows revealed nothing, yet its presence was undeniable, like a shadow that didn't belong in the dust and clamor of the street. As it approached, the hum of its engine cut cleanly through the market's chaos. People glanced over, some stepping aside instinctively. Others paused mid-shout, craning their necks to see who would dare drive a car like that through a place like this. It wasn't just any vehicle. It was an official car. Government plates, flawless paint, quiet authority, a presence that silenced people without a word. The closer it came, the more the crowd parted. Like water retreating from a stone, they moved aside, not out of courtesy, but curiosity, even reverence. Some whispered, some pointed, a few even reached for their phones again. The roar of accusation began to fade, replaced by a hush of uncertainty. Something had changed. Something was arriving. Inside the car, President Ibrahim Traoré sat back in his seat, suit jacket open at the collar, his face marked with exhaustion from a long morning of meetings. He had insisted on taking a less crowded route back to the palace, just for a moment of quiet, but now his brow furrowed as he leaned toward the window, hearing the unmistakable tone of anger and panic, even over the hum of the engine. He tilted his head slightly. "Stop the car," he said firmly. The driver reacted immediately. The car eased to a gentle halt beside the scene, tires crunching softly on gravel. From his window, Ibrahim saw the ring of people, tight, tense, too loud for something trivial. His eyes narrowed. He hated public chaos. It often meant injustice, hiding beneath noise. He opened the door slowly, against the quiet protest of his security aide, who followed behind in a separate vehicle. "No need," the president said calmly. "I want to see for myself." And then he saw him. The moment his foot hit the dirt, his gaze locked on the figure at the center of the crowd. A frail man, shoulders stooped, cane trembling, face sagging, not just from age, but from shame. His shirt was sweat-soaked, coins scattered at his feet, his mouth open mid-breath as if words had been stolen from him. It was a face Ibrahim had not seen in decades, but he would never forget it. His breath caught in his throat. The noise around him faded. All he could hear was memory, chalk on a board, a stern voice telling him to sit straighter, to do better. That man, that same man, standing here now being humiliated by the very people he once helped shape. His jaw tightened. His eyes, usually calm, flashed with something deeper: grief, fury, disbelief. The crowd hadn't recognized him yet. Their attention was still on their prey. But that was about to change. Without another word, Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, alone, without bodyguards, without ceremony, and walked directly into the center of the noise. Not as a president, but as a man who had just seen his teacher publicly broken. And he was not going to stand for it. For a few seconds, no one moved. The crowd, once wild and snarling, stood frozen in mid-breath. The presence of the man now stepping between them had hit like a silent lightning bolt. Unexpected, unbelievable. There were no trumpets, no guards pushing people aside, no booming announcements. Just a tall man in a dark shirt, sleeves rolled up, eyes sharp with purpose, stepping forward like he belonged there. And he did. Someone gasped. "That's the president!" Another voice followed, cracking like dry wood. "Ibrahim Traoré." The name spread through the crowd like a spark through dry grass. Mouths opened, eyes widened, and people instinctively stepped back, not out of fear, but shock. The marketplace, once a stage of chaos, transformed into a sanctuary of silence. Even the street vendors stopped fanning their fires. Even the phones stopped recording. The president didn't look left or right. He walked with unwavering steps, straight toward the man in the center. The man hunched over, swaying slightly, clutching nothing but his cane and his breath. "Thay," Ibrahim said softly, voice low, thick with something deeper than memory. Mr. Dumbia looked up slowly, eyes clouded by both age and disbelief. He blinked as if seeing a mirage. For a heartbeat, he didn't recognize the figure standing before him. The face was older, more chiseled. But the eyes, those eyes were familiar, focused, steady, the same eyes that used to stare up from the front row of his classroom, filled with questions too big for a child to ask. Ibrahim, he whispered, the name cracking in his throat like a forgotten prayer. The president stepped closer. He didn't extend a hand, not yet. He only looked at him, truly looked, with the depth of a man who had just been reminded of who he was and who had made him. Yes, Ibrahim replied gently. It's me. Mr. Dumbia's lips trembled. The noise of the world seemed to collapse around him. His knees weakened, not from shame this time, but from the tidal wave of recognition that swept through his chest. A student, his student, now the president, now here. Tears welled up and spilled over, tracing new paths down his dusty cheeks. He raised a trembling hand, not to shield himself, but to reach, as if to confirm that this was real. Ibrahim, Konquathai, he murmured in his native tongue. You came? The president stepped forward and gently took his teacher's hand, the way a son might hold his father's. There was no formality, no politics, only a bond that had endured time and silence. The hand he held was dry, fragile, but still carried the weight of knowledge and the scars of years spent shaping minds. And then, with no hesitation, Ibrahim bent slightly and helped Mr. Dumia sit down on a nearby wooden crate someone had dragged over, like placing a king back on his throne. The gesture was simple, but it echoed louder than any speech could have. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Some lowered their eyes. Others felt a sting in their chests they couldn't quite name. The spectacle was over. This was no longer about theft, no longer about a coin or a corn. This was about something bigger, something sacred. A nation's president had just knelt before a forgotten teacher. And in that moment, everyone remembered what respect truly looked like. The silence that had blanketed the market cracked, not with sound, but with tension. All eyes turned toward one person now, Miriam. She stood frozen beside her small charcoal grill, the roasted corn still smoking behind her, but all heat had left her face. Her arms were stiff at her sides, her lips slightly parted, as if words were trying to form, but kept collapsing before they could reach air. President Ibrahim Traoré turned to her slowly, not angrily, not dramatically, but with the quiet power of a man who already knew the answer and simply wanted the world to hear it spoken aloud. Are you accusing him? His voice was calm even, but there was something behind it, a weight, a gravity that made the simple question feel like judgment itself. Miriam's throat tightened. Her gaze dropped to the dirt, then quickly flicked back up. Dozens of eyes watched her, some with suspicion, some with disdain, some still unsure whether to fear her or pity her. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then stammered, Sir, he came to my counter, and he didn't pay enough. I just... She said he stole it, Ibrahim interrupted, his tone still level. I heard it clearly when my car stopped. Mariam's lips trembled. I thought so. I'm not sure. But he just took the corn and... You're not sure? Ibrahim stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. And you called him a thief? In front of how many people? You yelled, humiliated him in the middle of the market, demanded people to videotape him. All because you thought so? Miriam swallowed hard. Her voice, once loud and cutting, was now a mere whimper. I just want to protect my goods. The president didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned toward the old man now seated beside him, still gripping his cane, still too stunned to fully absorb the shift in reality. Ibrahim lowered himself slightly to meet the elder's eyes. Teacher, he said gently, is that right? Did you take anything from her? Mr. Dumia didn't answer at first. His lips trembled, eyes wet, the shame still lingering in his body like a slow poison. Then after a breath that felt like a lifetime, he shook his head, once, firmly. No, he whispered. I just wanted an ear of corn. I gave her all the money I had. His voice was thin, like wind through old leaves, but it carried. Another silence fell, a heavier one, the kind that presses on shoulders and sinks into skin. Ibrahim stood back up, He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout, but somehow every syllable struck like thunder. My teacher, the one who taught me how to read, how to write, how to distinguish right from wrong, the one who devoted his whole life to educating children like me. Today he was called a thief, humiliated because of an ear of corn. He turned toward Miriam again, who now looked much smaller than before. You forgot the most basic thing. There are people who don't need to prove their worth. They've lived their whole lives proving it. Miriam's face crumpled. Her eyes welled up. I don't know. I really don't know who he is. It's because you don't know, Ibrahim said softly. But you should learn to be kind to everyone, no matter who they are. He looked around the circle now, at the vendors, the bystanders, the ones who had laughed, pointed, whispered. None of them met his eyes. She is slanderous, Ibrahim continued. But it wasn't just her. All of you here watched, contributed, filmed, humiliated an innocent man. And no one asked him a question. A man in the crowd lowered his phone. A woman wiped her eye. Next time, Ibrahim said, voice lowering, remember today. Remember who you have offended. Because next, it could be your father, your mother, you. Then he turned back to Mr. Dumbia. You have taught me patience, he said softly. Now I will teach them justice. And for the first time since it all began, Mr. Dumbia closed his eyes and exhaled. President Ibrahim Traoré turned once more to face the crowd. His eyes, moments ago soft with reverence for his teacher, now burned with a different fire, the fire of quiet justice, tempered by pain, sharpened by purpose. He spoke not with anger, but with certainty. Every word landed like a stone, skipping across still water. Ripples of truth echoing outward. He, Ibrahim said, gesturing toward Mr. Dumbia, who now sat still and silent beside the cornstall. He was the one who taught me to write my first words. He was the one who was patient with me, a poor child with nothing but hope and eyes full of questions. The crowd remained motionless. No one interrupted. He, Ibrahim continued, voice gaining weight, taught me morality, taught me respect, taught me right from wrong. It is because of him that I know how to bow my head when I'm wrong. It is because of him that I can stand before you today, in this position. He paused. And today, you have disgraced him. Not just an old man, but a generation of teachers who raised this country. Several people lowered their eyes. Some swallowed hard. A woman clutched her scarf tightly. A man turned off his phone, ashamed he had been recording only minutes before. Miriam stood frozen, her hands clasped before her, eyes wide and wet. But she said nothing. The weight of collective shame had already begun to close in. Ibrahim took a slow breath and spoke again. This time not as a president, but as a former student carrying the legacy of a classroom. If he were a stranger, you still have no right to judge him like that. But he is not a stranger. He is our root, the foundation of what is good that remains. Then quietly but firmly, he turned to one of the officers standing near the edge of the crowd. Catch her, he ordered, crime of slander and disturbing public order. There was no resistance, no argument. The two officers stepped forward, and Miriam didn't move. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She looked not at Ibrahim, not at the officers, but at Mr. Dumbia. Her expression was no longer defensive nor pleading. It was empty, defeated. The officers took her gently by the arms. She didn't fight, didn't cry. She walked like someone who had just seen herself in a mirror for the first time and didn't like what she saw. And as she was led away, the crowd remained eerily silent. No one cheered. No one clapped. This was not a victory. This was a reckoning. The market, once full of laughter and clamor and fire, now stood like a courtroom without walls. In this open space where minutes ago people had yelled thief without thought, they now whispered only to themselves, or not at all. Some looked to the ground, others looked toward the president, then quickly away. Ibrahim stood still for a moment longer, his gaze sweeping across the faces, young and old. Do you know, he said, if it weren't for him, I probably wouldn't be here today. Not as president, But as a man of conscience? No one answered. And that perhaps was the first honest moment the crowd had shared all day. Then slowly Ibrahim turned back to his teacher. Without a word, he leaned forward and picked up the small cloth that had fallen from Mr. Dumbia's hand earlier, the one that had held the few coins he brought for the corn. He folded it gently, placed it back into the old man's hand, and closed his fingers around it. "You don't have to apologize for being poor," he said. "Only the heartless have anything to be ashamed of." Mr. Dumbia looked at him with tired eyes, full of water, full of something no words could hold. The crowd stood still as the sun shifted westward. A slow, aching stillness settled like dusk across the market. A silence not born of fear, but of reflection. Justice that day had not come from a courtroom. It had come from a memory, a bond, and a voice that chose to speak when others stayed silent. And in that silence, a lesson had finally been learned. The market didn't make a sound as President Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, reached for the car door himself, and opened it. Not as a man of power, but as a student honoring his teacher. No assistants, no guards, just him. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the stunned faces, watching in silence. He turned to Mr. Dumbia and gently extended his hand. "Let's go home, sir," he said softly. The old man hesitated, not because he didn't want to go, but because the moment felt surreal. His legs trembled as he stood, not just from exhaustion, but from the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Ibrahim placed one arm around him, supporting his frail frame with steady care. The crowd watched as the president of the nation helped an old teacher into the back seat of a presidential car with the tenderness of a son. As the door shut and the vehicle pulled away, the marketplace faded behind them, still hushed, still ashamed. Inside the car, silence settled again, but it was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of injustice. It was the quiet of healing. Neither man spoke for several minutes. The hum of the engine, the smooth glide of tires against the road, and the faint sounds of the city beyond the windows were all that remained. Mr. Dumbia sat upright, still holding the folded handkerchief in his lap. His fingers trembled. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, but his thoughts drifted. He couldn't find the words, and even if he could, his throat had closed with emotion. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed by the tears he couldn't control. Ibrahim noticed but said nothing. He simply reached across the seat, placed a steady hand over his teacher's, and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I remember the day you taught us about truth," the president finally said, his voice quiet but clear. "You told us it wasn't something we inherited. It was something we chose, every day." Mr. Dumbia turned his head slowly toward him, eyes wide with memory. "You told us," Ibrahim continued, "that doing the right thing would never be the easiest path, but it would be the one we'd never regret." He paused, exhaled. "Today, I just gave back a little of what you gave me. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's a start." Mr. Dumbia looked at him, and for a long time said nothing. His face, weathered by years and worn down by silence, softened. Finally he whispered, "Ibrahim, you remembered." The president smiled. "I never forgot, Thay," he said in his native tongue. "Not for one day." The car continued toward the presidential residence, but inside the ride felt longer, not in time, but in depth. It was a journey back to everything that mattered: respect, memory, gratitude. And for the first time in many years, Mr. Dumbia felt seen, not as a poor old man, but as someone who had planted something good and now lived long enough to watch it rise. When the presidential car rolled past the iron gates of the palace, the guards snapped to attention. But what truly turned heads was not the vehicle. It was the man who stepped out first. President Ibrahim Traoré emerged from the back seat, not in full presidential posture, but with a gentleness unfamiliar to the soldiers standing by. He rounded the car and opened the other rear door himself. Slowly, carefully, he extended his arm. The man who took it, dressed in faded clothes and worn shoes, seemed out of place in the marble-paved driveway of the nation's highest residence. His name, unknown to most there, was not spoken, but the way the president supported him said more than introductions ever could. A murmur rippled through the staff gathered near the entrance. Housekeepers, aides, cooks. They all paused in quiet surprise as they watched their head of state escort an elderly man, with care only reserved, in their minds, for royalty or foreign dignitaries. "Prepare a guest room," Ibrahim said quietly to the chief attendant. "A good one. He stays here for now." There were no questions. Inside the palace, polished floors reflected the chandeliers above, and cool air swept gently through corridors lined with art and history. But Mr. Dumbia didn't notice the elegance. His focus was on every hand that didn't push him away, every eye that didn't glare with suspicion, every corner of the room that welcomed instead of rejected. The staff showed him to a guest room down the east wing, a place usually reserved for visiting diplomats. The doors opened to reveal a room awash with golden light. The curtains were drawn open, revealing a view of the gardens beyond. A bed stood near the center, large, clean, covered with white sheets and thick blankets. There was a reading chair near a window, and beside it a small wooden table with a fresh pot of tea already waiting. He stood at the threshold for a moment, unsure if he was meant to walk in. The steward smiled and said, "Please, sir, this is yours." His feet carried him slowly into the room, as if testing whether it was a dream. He touched the edge of the bed, felt the softness of the blanket. His fingers, still trembling, moved to the pillow. He didn't sit. Not yet. His eyes scanned everything. The neatly folded towels, the small basket of fruit, the quiet hum of the air conditioner. There was no dust, no cracked ceiling, no leaking roof. He turned slightly and looked at the steward. "Are you sure this is for me?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The steward smiled. The president insisted. Dinner came shortly after. Not extravagant, but warm. Real rice, well-seasoned chicken, a bowl of soft vegetables, and a slice of sweet mango. Served on proper plates, with cold water poured into a clean glass. He didn't touch the food at first. He simply looked at it. It had been a long time since someone had served him a meal without rushing him, without making him feel like a burden. When he finally sat down to eat, his hands moved slowly. He chewed in silence, and before he could finish, tears began to roll down his cheeks. This time, he didn't cry from shame or confusion or loneliness. He cried because for the first time in years, he was not surviving. He was living. He was not being tolerated. He was being respected, not for what he had, not for what he could still offer, but simply for who he was and who he had been. He looked around the room once more, then reached over and touched the warm surface of the table. The last time he had eaten on a table like this, his wife had still been alive. He had still been teaching. Life had still felt like it had meaning. That night, as he lay down on the soft bed, beneath clean sheets and a roof that didn't leak, Mr. Dumbia finally allowed his body to rest without fear, without cold, without hunger. And as his eyes closed, he whispered one word to the silence: "Thank you." The press conference was announced with less than 12 hours' notice. Yet by morning, every major TV station, radio frequency, and news website in the country was tuned in. The presidential seal stood behind the podium, 2 flags flanking each side. Cameras were already rolling. Microphones from dozens of media outlets bristled from the stand like antennae. Inside the room, there was a quiet buzz of anticipation. But it wasn't like other press events. This one felt different, heavier, more human. President Ibrahim Traoré entered without fanfare. No grand introduction, no military salute. He wore a plain dark suit and walked calmly to the center, accompanied by a figure most people had never seen before, but now recognized instantly. It was Mr. Dumbia, clean-shaven, dressed in a modest but elegant new outfit of deep indigo with embroidered cuffs. His back still slightly hunched, but his head held higher. A gentle dignity had returned to his posture. The lines on his face remained, but now they held peace, not pain. As the 2 men stood side by side, the cameras flashed wildly. But the president didn't begin with statements or statistics. He looked directly into the lens of the center camera and began to speak, voice steady, low, sincere. "Yesterday," he said, "something happened that should shame us all." He paused for just a moment. In a crowded market, an old man was publicly humiliated, accused without evidence, shouted at, filmed, insulted, nearly broken, all for the crime of wanting to buy a roasted corn with what little he had. A murmur of guilt passed through the room. Even the reporters weren't scribbling notes. They were listening. That man, the president continued, is not just anyone. He is a teacher, a man who shaped minds and spirits for more than 30 years. He taught me, he taught many others, and yet yesterday he was nearly destroyed in front of strangers who had forgotten what he represented. He turned slightly and gestured to Mr. Dumbia, who stood quietly beside him, eyes lowered but glistening. And so today, Ibrahim said, I speak not just as president, but as a student, as a citizen, as a son of the soil. I offer an apology, not just to Mr. Dumbia, but to every teacher, every elder, every person whose dignity we've ignored, forgotten, or crushed in our rush to judge. Then came the words that would echo across the country. No one has the right to humiliate those who built us. The room fell completely silent. We have become quick to blame, slow to listen. We record first and ask questions later. But if we are to heal as a society, if we are to protect what truly matters, we must change. He looked down for a moment, collecting himself, then said quietly, from today, this government will recognize and protect retired educators as national assets. Their dignity is not optional, it is sacred. The announcement was followed by another, a new national initiative to provide pensions for teachers who had served beyond 20 years, free health care for elderly educators, and a yearly ceremony to honor retired public servants. But it wasn't the policies that captured the heart of the nation. It was the apology, the humility. The moment went viral almost instantly. Social media lit up with the hashtag #ThankYourTeacher. People began posting photos of old report cards, handwritten notes from mentors, blurry class pictures. Messages flooded in from students remembering those who had corrected them, believed in them, made them who they were. I still remember the day my math teacher stayed after school for me. I cried watching this. My mom taught for 32 years. Today she cried for the first time in ages because someone remembered. In schools across the country, children were asked to write letters of thanks. In markets, vendors served free meals to retired teachers. In neighborhoods, former students came knocking on old doors, carrying fruit, clothes, simple words. I'm sorry I forgot. Mr. Dumbia said little during the conference. But after the speech ended and applause quietly filled the room, a journalist asked if he wanted to say something. He stepped up to the microphone, voice soft. I taught with love. I didn't expect to be remembered. But today I feel human again. And that was all he said. But it was all that needed to be said. The light inside the holding cell flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. It wasn't dark, but it wasn't truly bright either, just a cold, indifferent gray. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of a distant door and the soft clink of metal as Miriam shifted on the bench, restless, then still. Her hands gripped the edge of the seat. Her knuckles were white. Her breath came in shallow bursts. The reality of where she was, what had happened, was finally sinking in. At first, when they brought her in, she had still been defensive, even angry. She had told herself it was all a misunderstanding, that maybe they'd realize it wasn't that serious, that someone else, anyone else, would be blamed. But as the hours passed and no one came to shout or argue or defend her, the silence began to echo louder than any crowd had ever done. She was alone, and the silence forced her to face the one thing she had never made time for, herself. She sat curled up on the bench, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, trying to stop the shaking in her stomach. Her eyes, once sharp with judgment, were now red and raw, swollen from tears she had tried to hide from the guards. Then came the knock. It was soft, not out of kindness, but routine. The iron door opened slowly, and a police officer stepped in, notepad in hand, expression neutral, but not cold. Miriam looked up, startled. Her voice cracked before she could form words. Am I going to prison? The officer didn't answer the question immediately. He simply stepped forward and sat on the edge of the opposite bench, still holding his pad, but not writing anything. Instead, he asked, "Do you know what you did?" Miriam opened her mouth, but no words came out. The officer waited. After a pause, she whispered, "I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would get this big." He nodded slightly, then said quietly, "Your lie almost killed an old man." The words hit like a stone thrown into water. The ripples inside her chest were instant. Guilt, regret, shame, disbelief. "I didn't know he was someone important," she blurted out. The officer looked her straight in the eye. "Does that matter?" Miriam dropped her gaze. "No." She bit her lip, hard, trying to hold back the tears building again in her throat. I was angry," she continued. "I don't even know why. He didn't even do anything. He was polite. He called me my daughter. But I looked at his clothes, his coin, and I felt weak," the officer offered. She nodded, like I needed to show I was better. He didn't speak. She went on. "I said the word thief before I could stop myself. And when people came, I don't know, I just kept going. I lied, loudly, because part of me wanted them to believe it. It made me feel powerful." Her voice cracked. "But it wasn't power. It was hate. Ugly hate I didn't even know was inside me." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing now, the truth finally unraveling from the knot in her chest. "I didn't mean to ruin him. I didn't mean to," the officer interrupted gently. "You didn't mean to, but you almost did." He stood slowly and stepped toward the door, then paused and looked back. "Do you know what's worse than cruelty?" he asked. Miriam didn't answer. "Cruelty done without thinking." Then he left. The door closed with a dull metallic thud, and Miriam sat in the silence once again. Only now, it wasn't just the walls holding her in. It was the weight of what she had become, what she had revealed in herself. She wasn't afraid of the sentence anymore. She was afraid of who she had been, and for the first time in her life, she wished she could go back, not to avoid punishment, but to choose differently when no one was watching. But time doesn't rewind, and neither does trust. The iron door groaned as it opened, slower than usual. Miriam looked up instinctively, expecting a guard with more paperwork or perhaps a summons to court. But what she saw instead made her blood drain instantly from her face. President Ibrahim Traoré. He stood just beyond the threshold, his silhouette framed by the corridor light behind him. Dressed simply but impeccably, his presence filled the small cell without needing to say a word. There were no cameras, no reporters, no bodyguards beside him, just him, and the silence that followed him like a shadow. Miriam stood up too quickly and stumbled back, as if his gaze physically pushed her away. Her voice caught in her throat. Mr. President," she whispered, breathless. Her knees bent instinctively, and she began to drop down in apology, but he raised one hand, not harshly, not to command, but to pause. "No need," he said calmly. "I didn't come here to humiliate you." She stopped halfway down, caught between standing and kneeling, unsure what to do. She finally sat back on the bench, eyes locked on the floor. I didn't think you would ever come here," she murmured. "I came," he said, stepping forward, "not because I'm angry, but because I want you to understand what you've done." Miriam didn't respond. He sat down across from her, not in authority, but in deliberate proximity. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the hum of the prison's old ventilation fan and Miriam's shallow breathing. "You didn't destroy Mr. Dumbia," he said, "but you nearly did. You don't realize how close your lie came to ending his life, not physically, but spiritually. The shame, the betrayal, the way people turned on him so quickly." Miriam's hands trembled in her lap. "I didn't think it would go that far," she whispered. "It was just one moment, one word." "Words are never just," Ibrahim said gently but firmly. "Not when they come with power, and you had power that day. You had the attention of the crowd, and instead of using it to tell the truth, you used it to feed your ego, to satisfy your pride." Miriam's eyes filled again, but this time, she didn't try to hide the tears. She let them fall. "I'm sorry," she said, "not just because I was caught, but because I see now. I see what I became. I see the face of who I was in that moment, and I hate it. Ibrahim studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good, he said, because that hatred is the beginning of change. He stood slowly and turned toward the door. Before leaving, he looked back over his shoulder. I'm not here to punish you, he said. The law will handle that. I'm here so that when you walk out of here one day, you don't walk out unchanged. She lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze for the first time. Thank you for seeing me, even after what I did. He gave a slight nod and stepped out. The door closed behind him, not with finality, but with the quiet possibility of redemption. 3 days had passed since the president's unexpected visit to the prison. During those days, Miriam barely spoke. She ate little, slept only in short intervals, and spent most of her time sitting in the corner of her cell, staring at nothing. Something inside her had shifted, not out of fear, but awakening. The words he had spoken echoed relentlessly in her mind. I want you to understand what you've done. That morning, she was summoned without warning. The guards opened her cell quietly. No shouting, no force, just a simple, firm instruction. Come. The president is waiting. She followed in silence. This time, the meeting wasn't in a cell. She was led to a plain room inside the facility. Simple chairs, a wooden table, a window letting in sunlight. Ibrahim Traoré was already seated, arms folded gently in front of him. He looked at her not as an enemy, nor as a ruler, but with the calm expression of someone who had made a difficult decision. She entered with her head bowed. Miriam, he said softly. Her knees gave out before she even reached the chair. She dropped to the floor, overcome with emotion. I'm sorry, she whispered. Not just to you, not just to the teacher, but to this country, to everyone I showed that cruelty is easier than kindness. He waited. I should have been better, she continued. And I will be if I'm given the chance. President Traoré stood up slowly. He didn't help her up, not out of cruelty, but to allow her to rise on her own. And she did, with effort, with tears streaming down her face. But she stood. Then he spoke. I've decided to pardon you. The words stunned her. Her mouth opened slightly in disbelief. But before she could speak, he continued. But not because what you did was small, and not because you deserve to forget it. He stepped closer. You will be free, but not untouched. From this day forward, you will live as a reminder, a living lesson, not of shame, but of how quickly hate can grow and how slowly trust is rebuilt. Miriam nodded slowly, tears still falling. You will speak to communities, he continued, to schools, to markets, to families. You will tell your story, not as a victim, but as someone who nearly destroyed an innocent man with a lie. She nodded again, this time more firmly. I will, she said. I want to. I want to show people that silence when you're wrong is worse than punishment. There was a long pause. Then he said gently, You are not the only person in this country who's ever spoken with hate. But you might be one of the few who's given the chance to make it mean something. Miriam wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Her voice trembled. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to thank me, he said. Thank the man you tried to destroy. He forgave you first. That was when Miriam finally broke, not from shame, but from humility. She placed a hand on her chest, took a deep breath, and stood taller than she had in weeks. When I tell the story, she said quietly, I'll start with how I failed, but I'll end with how I changed. President Traoré nodded. That's the only story that matters. And with that, the guards escorted her out, not as a prisoner, but as someone reborn into responsibility. Outside the facility, the air was warm. Birds sang. Somewhere far away, a school bell rang. And as she stepped into the light, Miriam took her first steps, not into freedom, but into the long, patient road of redemption. A soft breeze rustled through the neem trees lining the quiet road, carrying with it the scent of distant blossoms and freshly cut grass. It was a peaceful morning, the kind that held a stillness rare in the city, just birdsong and sunlight gently dappling the path ahead. The car slowed as it approached a small gated property on the edge of town, about 20 minutes from the capital. It was not extravagant, not marked by marble columns or fountains, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, A modest, clean, and peaceful home tucked beneath shade trees, with wide windows that welcomed the morning light. President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out first. Then gently he opened the passenger door and extended his hand to Mr. Doumbia. "Come," he said with a warm smile. "I have something to show you." The old teacher stepped out slowly, his joints still stiff, but his eyes curious. He looked around, at the flowers growing along the walkway, the fresh coat of white paint on the walls, the porch swing hanging from a beam. "This is for you," the president said simply. Mr. Doumbia blinked. He stared at the house again, as if trying to understand what he had just heard. "For me?" Ibrahim nodded. "A place that's yours. Quiet, safe, close to the city but far from the noise. Somewhere you can rest, read, breathe. A place to call home." They walked up the steps together. The front door opened into a sunlit living room. Inside were a few armchairs, a reading lamp, a bookshelf already half filled, and a clean, inviting scent of cedarwood. The kitchen had everything he needed, simple and practical. There was even a small garden in the back, with vegetables already sprouting in neat rows. The bedroom was painted a soft cream. On the bedside table lay a note in a clean envelope. Mr. Doumbia opened it carefully. Inside, handwritten in smooth cursive, were the words, "For the one who taught us to build. May this roof be your peace, and these walls your well-earned rest." His eyes filled again. He folded the paper gently and placed it back on the table. Turning to the president, he tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Ibrahim stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've spent your whole life giving," he said softly. "Now let the world give something back." Mr. Doumbia looked around one more time, then back at his student, now a man, now a leader. He nodded slowly, voice trembling. "I never asked for anything. But this feels like being remembered." President Traoré smiled again. "You're not just remembered, Thay. You're honored." And as they stood in the heart of the house, surrounded by peace and light, for the first time in many years, Mr. Doumbia felt what every teacher dreams of in their final chapters. Not forgotten, but fulfilled. A week after settling into his new home, Mr. Doumbia received a second surprise. It was a calm morning, and the air carried the earthy scent of dew and soil. President Ibrahim Traoré arrived in a modest car, unannounced except for a quiet knock on the door. "Come with me," he said, smiling. They drove for only a few minutes, weaving through tree-lined roads until they reached a quiet street near the town's central square. At the corner, tucked between a bakery and a small tailor's shop, stood a freshly painted building. The sign above the door read, "Doumbia's Books, Wisdom for All Generations." Mr. Doumbia froze in place. The front window displayed shelves of books, some old, some new. Inside, warm light spilled onto wooden floors. A table by the window was set with tea and 2 chairs. The shop was small but full of life. Books on philosophy, history, language, and literature neatly arranged. There was even a wall labeled "Stories That Shaped Our Nation," featuring local authors and rare editions. The president turned to him. "This isn't for you to work in," he said. "You don't need to sell books. You only need to sit, to read, to talk, if you feel like it. Let this place remind the world that your mind, your wisdom, still matter." Tears brimmed in Mr. Doumbia's eyes. "I haven't been in a bookshop in years," he whispered. "Just the smell of these pages. It brings me back to my younger days, to the classroom." Ibrahim smiled. "Then let it bring you forward too. You once said books give you life, so here's a place to keep living, with them and through them." Later that day, a few children wandered in, curious. One asked shyly, "Are you the man who taught the president?" Mr. Doumbia chuckled, eyes twinkling behind his glasses. "I taught many children," he said softly. "But yes, he was one of mine." And as he sat among the shelves, the pages of old stories surrounding him, Mr. Doumbia was no longer just a memory. He had become a living part of the nation's soul once more. The days passed gently, like pages turning in a well-loved book. Each morning, Mr. Doumbia would rise with the sun, brew a simple cup of tea, and walk to his little bookshop on the corner. The path from his new home to the store was lined with flowering bushes, and neighbors often greeted him with smiles, some even offering baskets of fruit or warm bread along the way. Inside the shop, he moved slowly but purposefully, dusting the shelves, rearranging titles, choosing which book to read that day by the window. Sometimes he would sit for hours, lost in the comfort of old pages and familiar wisdom. But more often than not, someone would come in, a curious student, a parent, a teacher, or even a stranger just seeking conversation. They didn't come for discounts or purchases. They came for something rarer, to sit, to listen, and to ask. Sir, what would you do if your child stopped believing in themselves? Do you remember what inspired you to teach? Can I just tell you what I'm going through? And Mr. Dumya would smile, lean in, and listen with the same attentiveness he once gave his students in crowded classrooms. He never preached. He only spoke when the moment asked for it, but his words, when they came, were soft and filled with quiet strength. He wasn't rich, he wasn't young, but he was respected, loved, useful. And in the final stretch of his life, Mr. Dumbia found what many spend a lifetime chasing: peace, purpose, and the joy of being gently remembered. Not for what he had, but for who he had always been. Within hours of the national apology, short clips from the marketplace and the press conference sweep across social media. Hashtags like never judge and hashtag thank your teacher trend on every platform. International news outlets pick up the story, framing it as a lesson in humility from West Africa. Parents everywhere retell the event at dinner tables, reminding their children to respect elders and think before they condemn. University students post open letters praising their former teachers. Primary school kids draw pictures of classrooms with captions that read, "My teacher is a hero." In cafes and buses, strangers share the link, shaking their heads at how close society came to destroying a good man, and smiling at how quickly compassion can course-correct an entire nation. The ripple becomes a tide. Talk show hosts invite educators to speak about dignity. Newspapers publish editorials urging readers to pause before passing judgment. Small policy shifts follow. Local councils introduce teacher appreciation days, and businesses begin offering discounts to retirees who once worked in schools. Street vendors, remembering Miriam's mistake, now greet elderly customers with an extra measure of patience. In a televised address, President Ibrahim Traoré sums up the collective awakening. A country that forgets gratitude loses its very soul. The phrase lodges in the public conscience. It appears on billboards, classroom posters, and even bumper stickers. While prejudice and haste do not vanish overnight, the nation takes a deliberate step toward kindness, each citizen reminded that every accusation carries a human cost. Late one golden afternoon, the little bookshop glows under soft light. Mr. Dumbia sits by the window, leafing through a weathered classic. The quiet rustle of pages mingles with the distant hum of city life. The door chimes softly. President Traoré enters alone. No entourage, no cameras. He removes his jacket, drapes it over a chair, and selects a book from the nearest shelf. Without ceremony, he sits beside his teacher. For several minutes, they read in silence, sharing nothing but the rhythmic turning of pages and the comfortable warmth of companionship. At last, they both look up. Their eyes meet, one pair aged, wise, content, the other grateful, resolute, forever a student. No words are exchanged, none are needed. In that quiet moment, a nation's journey crystallizes into a single truth. The seeds of knowledge sown in humility can, in time, bear fruit powerful enough to reshape an entire society. Outside, the setting sun bathes the shop in amber light, sealing the day and the story with a hush of enduring respect. This story reminds me that dignity and cruelty often hinge on a single impulsive word. An old teacher, stripped of honor by a careless crowd, is restored by the grateful pupil he once guided. The arc proves that power can kneel, apology can heal, and a society can recalibrate when conscience overrides convenience. Yet the lesson is fragile. It lives only if we practice it daily, listening before judging, thanking before forgetting. Gratitude is not nostalgia, it is social oxygen. Without it, communities suffocate. When did you last pause to honor someone who quietly shaped your life? Tell me in comments. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.